Hey, welcome to the sixth lesson. During this lesson, we will study all the basic loops, as well as operators within loops, in the C++ language. To begin with, let's clarify what loops are. Loops are special constructs that allow you to execute a piece of code multiple times in a row. Moreover, you specify the number of code executions yourself. In the C++ language, there are three types of loops: the for loop, the while loop, and the do-while loop. All these loops perform the same task: they execute the same piece of code several times in succession. The difference between these types of loops lies only in the way they are written. And let's start with a loop like for. To create such a loop, we write the keyword for, then specify the conditions within parentheses. Here, we indicate the starting point of the loop, the end point, and how our loop will change. Inside the parentheses, as the first parameter, we create a variable. Of course, you can create the variable separately, but usually, in a for loop, the variable is created directly inside the parentheses. Let's create a variable, name it I, and set its default value to 0. Then we put a semicolon and specify the second value of this loop. Here, we set the condition for how long our loop will run. Suppose I say that our loop will run until our variable I is less than the number 10. Again, put a semicolon. Finally, we specify how our variable I will change. I want to mention that our variable I will increase by 1 for each iteration, or each loop cycle. So, now we have created a loop that goes from 0 to 10, and each time, 1 unit is added to the variable during each cycle. In other words, our loop will run 10 times. Then we open curly braces, and everything inside curly braces will be executed as many times as the loop runs. I will just output our variable I. Let's try to run this and see what we got. It turns out that we displayed information from 0 to 9 inclusive. So, our loop worked 10 times, from 0 to 9, exactly as we specified in the conditions. Of course, we can change these conditions as we wish. If I want to display all numbers from 1 to 10, we need to set the starting value for the variable I as 1 and specify in the condition, less than or equal to 10, or less than 11. If we run this, we will see that now information is displayed from 1 to 10 inclusive. Now let's specify that our variable will be equal to 100 and say that our entire loop will change as long as I is greater than or equal to the number 10. And here we will decrease I by 15 each time. If we run the program now, you can see that each time a number is displayed that is 15 less than the previous one, up to 10. Another point worth noting is that if there is only one line of code in our loop, we can remove these curly braces. In this case, everything will still work correctly. Now, let's consider the next loop. It's called the while loop. Again, the working principle of all loops is the same. We simply execute the same code multiple times in a row. The only difference is in how they are written. In the for loop, we specify all conditions inside the parentheses, while in the while loop, we only indicate one parameter inside the parentheses, which is the condition itself. The loop continues to execute as long as this condition is true. Once the condition becomes false, the loop stops. Let's create a while loop. Initially, we create a variable, and I'll set its initial value to 0. Then I'll state that the loop will continue as long as our variable is less than 10. Here in the loop, I need to increment our value by 1 each time. Let's print this variable to the screen. You may notice that the only difference is that in the while loop, we wrote only one condition. We also create the variable outside the loop, and inside the loop, we need to change the variable. The parentheses contain only the condition. If we run this now, we'll get the same result as we did in the previous program with the for loop. Now, let's take a look at another loop, the do-while loop. Essentially, it is the same as the while loop. The only difference is that the do-while loop will always execute at least once. It performs an action first, then checks the condition. If the condition is true, it continues, otherwise, it stops. Let's write this loop. At the beginning, we use the keyword do to indicate that the loop should do something initially. Then we open curly braces, and at the very end, after the curly braces, we write while. Let's write the same loop we used before for comparison. We'll create a variable I and set its value to 100. Inside the loop, we'll decrement this variable by 10, and additionally, I'll print the variable to the screen. The condition for the loop is as follows: it will run as long as our variable is less than 10. You may notice that the condition is initially false because our variable is already greater than 10. If we had written the same condition in a while or for loop, the loop wouldn't have executed at all. However, since we are working with a do-while loop, it guarantees that the loop will execute once, then check the condition. If the condition is true, it continues; if false, it simply terminates. Let's try running this and notice that our loop executed only once, even though the condition was false. So, these are the three main loops in the C++ language. We will reinforce our knowledge of loops with more examples in subsequent lessons. First, let's write a regular loop to refresh our memory. We create a loop that goes from 1 to 15, incrementing the variable I by 1 each time. Inside the loop, we print the variable to the screen. Also, at the end, we use endl to perform a line break. If we run this loop, we'll see that it simply outputs numbers from 1 to 14. Now, let's modify it so that if we reach the number 10, we want to exit the loop. For this, we need to add a check. In this check, we refer to the variable I, and if this variable equals 10, then in this case, I want to exit the loop. For this, we need a special operator called break. I want to note that we are already familiar with break from when we used it in switch case. Here, it serves the same purpose. So, when we reach the number 10 and encounter the break statement, the program will exit the loop and continue its further execution. Let's run the program, and we see that now it outputs elements from 1 to 9, and 10 is not printed as the break statement is triggered. The first operator we discussed is break, which exits the loop. Now let's look at the second operator, where we can skip one iteration. Let me try to make it so that we only print odd numbers. To implement this, we need to write a check. In this check, we refer to the variable I and obtain the remainder of division by 2. If the remainder of division by 2 is equal to 0, we understand that it is an even number. In this case, I will use the continue operator. Unlike break, the continue operator does not completely exit the loop, it simply skips the current iteration and proceeds to the next one. If I run the next iteration, you will notice that only even numbers are displayed on the screen, up to 9. No other numbers are output. So, these operators can be used in all types of loops. The break operator completely exits the loop, while the continue operator only skips one iteration. Now, let's consider a practical example. We will create a minigame where we need to guess a random number chosen by the computer. First, let's generate a random number. Let's call it random, and we will use the sran function, stating that we want to generate a random number in the range from 1 to 15. Also, I want a new random number to be picked each time, so we'll use the sran function along with the time function and the value null. Now, let's create another variable with the data type bool, which can only take two values, either true or false. This variable will be named stop, and its default value will be false. This means that initially, our game is not stopped, and the variable has the value false. Now, let's create a loop. For our game, we need either a while loop or a do-while loop. The reason we choose these loops is that I want our code to execute as long as the variable stop has the value true. Therefore, if we only have a condition, we always use either a while or do-while loop. The for loop is not particularly convenient in this case. I suggest using the do-while loop now, which means that we will execute the code inside it first, then check the condition. If the condition is still true, we will execute the code inside the loop again. I will immediately write the condition that our loop will execute as long as the variable stop is false. Now, inside the loop, let's add some information output. We will prompt the user to enter a number. This is necessary for the user to understand what is happening in the program and what number they need to enter. Next, we will get input from the user and store it in a variable, which I will create a bit higher and name it user input. I will simply put the data we get from the user into this variable. Then we will write a condition. The condition will be as follows. If user input is not equal to the random number chosen by the computer, then in this case, we will output to the screen you did not guess. And if this condition is false, it means the user has guessed, and in this case, we will set the variable stop to true. As soon as we indicate that the variable stop is true, our condition will become false, and the loop will no longer execute. After the loop, I will output information that the user guessed the number, and this information will be displayed only if we exited the loop. But if we exited the loop, we know that the user won. Now let's run this program. Here, I start entering numbers. In fact, you can guess the computer's random number for a while. You see, as soon as two numbers match, we win. Well, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you all soon, bye.